Well, good afternoon and welcome to Life Along the Merrimack. Each week we have a podcast and we talk about the history and health of the Merrimack River. Today we have an expert with us, John Macone. He's the outreach historian for the Merrimack River Watershed Council. He's a former editor of the Daily News and is also an avid boater. So I thought it'd be useful for him to be here, and as we talk about parts of the river, I'm going to defer to him and have him make some observations. One of my first questions, John, here is a river, of course. Now, this is a narrow river, and sometimes it has sandbars. Do newcomers have difficulty with this?
Dyke, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for calling me an expert. You've promoted me. I appreciate that. In answer to your question, it depends on the tide, actually. I think in this photo, what it looks like to me is the tide is in or very close to it. In fact, you can see the tide line in the background way up the river. It's very flat at the mouth in this photo and very safe to go in and out. And now it's a totally different picture if you had taken this picture like 4 or 5 hours later. When the tide is going out and the water is ripping out of here and the tide is pulling it as well, and the river currents coming out, it gets very dangerous. Right around where it says the Merrimack River in this picture, there's a sandbar there, and these enormous, called them standing waves, build up there, and they're very difficult for boats to get out through.
Well, as we move along, this is Joppa 96.3 radio, also on cablecast television. We're here weekly, and we're all trying to learn more because the river sometimes is getting dirtier rather than cleaner. It is about 117 miles long, John. As I understand it, a group went down there last summer from near Franklin, New Hampshire, or near Laconia, and came all the way down to the ocean, which is there on the right, Newburyport. So that was quite a trip for them. I think you watched a couple of them come in.
Yes, I did. I watched them come across. Yep.
Yeah.
And they just barely outran a huge windy rainstorm, and including the mayor of Newburyport. They went right across that open water. We were very worried about them because all we could see were enormous waves. We couldn't even see the kayakers, but they all made it safe.
And one thing to bring to attention is SOs, are called combined sewage overflow, including Haverhill, Lawrence, Lowell, and Manchester, get too much rainwater mixed with the effluent and many times have to discharge that. So I know you're aware of that, John, and we'll talk about that a little more in a moment. We always talk about the health and the history of the river. Here's Newburyport in about 1852. And this was done by Rich Jones, a wonderful artist in Newburyport. He's also the city clerk. And John, you've looked over history for quite a while. At one time, Newburyport had quite a bit of trade, not just in New England, but throughout the West Indies and the world.
Right, yeah. And there was such an enormous amount of shipbuilding going on. I read an account that said that there were 1,000 ships built on the 10-year span on either side of 1800. So 1,000 ships, and these are large ships, just in our area of the river alone.
I was going to comment on that myself. Look at how large these ships are. They're larger than some of the buildings, 300 feet long, more than 500 tons. I mean, these were real vessels and employed many, many people in Newburyport, not just the people on the vessels, but if you made sails, if you made rope, if you catered to the people who built them. There are many, many jobs involved. Here's another shot, John, that looks at towards the end of the tall ship era. This is a Symington in 1893, and it was one of the last tall ships. It looks like there were a lot of people. It looks like it was a big when the ship went out.
Yeah, look at that, getting it out. Those are a great set of shots. So that must be up in the area of the Faraj Shamet.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a deeper part of the river there. That's why those shipyards were there.
And you can see the craft work for many months on the left with some of these photos. And there were many craftsmen in Newburyport to do this, obviously. And historians say one of the reasons why some of the houses on High Street are so beautiful, not just outside, but inside, is because we had so many fellows and women who could work with wood and did a great job.
Mm. It's amazing to think how much wealth.
Here's a great deal of wealth was created. And one of the falls, or several falls on the Merrimack, and this was in Lowell a long time ago. And this is one of the falls in Lowell area. Henry David Thoreau is one person, this is way back in 1839, who said, if you keep building the mills, along the river, we're going to lose our fish. And John, you do some fishing. Years ago, they had thousands of sturgeon in the river, but as I understand it, when the mills came along, they couldn't go up and spawn anymore.
Right, yeah. Yeah, the mills, the dams really destroyed the fish population. And this was one of them. This was actually a later dam, the Pawtucket Falls Dam. The one in Lawrence is the first one they hit. And that was the largest dam in the world when it was first built. And it just stopped them dead in their tracks. They couldn't get beyond it. And the salmon and other fish populations that had been going up the river were almost went extinct in the river. I like what you say here. Henry David Thoreau took offense.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned
he didn't like the mills.
Because, the mills in Lowell, anyway, started in about 1823. And he came up the river in 1839 with his brother, and they wrote a book, Weeks Along the Merrimack and the Concord Rivers. They loved the Concord River, but he became very discouraged when he came into the Merrimack. He saw the mills and said, boy, this doesn't look good for the fish.
All
but
right.
I mention the fish because I know you've caught a lot of fish in the river in your day.
So, Dyke, is it safe to say that a lot of your
river in Lawrence?
Yeah, the spigot.
Yeah, so this is the some of the mills, and probably around the turn of the century, and you can see how many mills there were. The railroad trains had arrived, and the mills eventually created a bit of pollution, did they not, John?
They certainly did their share of that. That's right. The mills and also the cities, because the cities were dumping their sewage, their human waste, for the most part, directly into the river, piping it right into the river. And then, of course, the plants themselves, any kind of waste they had would go into the river too. And there are stories and photos too, of the river changing colors depending on the dye that they were using that day in the mills.
Well, even in the 1940s and 50s, in Newburyport, at least, the people I've talked to, there was quite a bit of sewage coming down. And it was, if kids fell in, they'd have to run home and get a bath or something. And you're right. I mean, there was an enormous amount of pollution in the rivers. Here is, a famous icon of a clock. It's in Lawrence. It was at one time the second largest in the world, next to Big Ben in London. And the clocks were helpful because not everybody had a watch in those days. Of course, many mill workers couldn't afford it. So, people had to know when their shift started. People wanted to know when to bring lunch to the mill. And so these clocks are very valuable. And I'm thinking, John, that in addition, the mills employed many people throughout, say, 1860 to 1930. A lot of people came to the mills.
That's for sure, yeah. Huge employers. And now this particular, that's called the air mill clock. And you can see you've got your other photo there, which is pretty neat, of the wood mill and the air mill. And those are, I've read that those were supposedly the largest textile mill in the world at that time. And of course, that half of that mill is gone now, but it's been completely, the other half that's still standing has been completely rehabbed. I was looking at it yesterday, and there's now a huge parking garage behind it and another addition going up. So now you have these old mills that have been abandoned for years, and people are living in them, and there are offices in them. And so people in cities, Lawrence and Lowell and Manchester, they're living on the riverbank again, which they hadn't done in so many years. Like you were saying, the pollution was so bad, nobody wanted to live next to the river.
Well, we will be talking about that pollution in a second. When we talk about the Merrimack River, of course, it goes into New Hampshire. Here's a shot of Manchester, New Hampshire. And they always say, this is the Muskey company on the left, all those buildings. And it said, the Muskey Manufacturing Company dominated the town. But it looks like the river is dominating down at this time. It's remarkable. In the flood of 1936, John, it's the rivers and main roads. You must have seen some of that because you put together a couple books on the Merrimack Valley yourself.
That's an incredible shot. Look at that. A neat thing I'm seeing in that photo too, Dyke, is on the left-hand side, you see where the mills are, and just behind the mills, you can see the parallel canals that ran through Manchester, and those canals are gone now. They're these wide streets, but you get a sense of all the engineering that was going on to support those mills, to provide the water power.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And one of the things that I wasn't aware of, there are scores of electric power stations that still get their power from the Merrimack River. And you mentioned this to me once, more than 500,000 people get their drinking water from the river. I think we all have a stake in a good river.
We sure do.
This would add on to your statement of a moment ago, John, that you can kind of see a sandbar there. And in the summertime, it's a good place to be. And you have a vessel. Did you go out much this summer?
No, I didn't. I wish I had gone out more. But I do love to go out the mouth of the river. It's very tricky, as you were mentioning, very dangerous. It's, well, you know this because you wrote your book on the Coast Guard. It's one of the 3 rivers on the East Coast where they have surf rescue parties, right? Because it's so dangerous. And boy, it can be really bad if the wind is blowing towards the river and the tide is going out. You get these huge waves at the mouth, just beyond the jetties there, or within the jetties. Make it really scary to try to get out.
Now, those jetties were built in about 2015. It was federal money, about $20 million in all. And the reason that the Corps of Engineers kept stating was, they wanted good navigation on the Merrimack. So we got 2 very expensive jetties. The Coast Guard, as you just mentioned, John, is a prevalent institution here. And here are some vessels up near the Coast Guard station in Newburyport. And they used to have a Coast Guard Day in August, on August 4th. The newspaper used to cover it. You used to assign people to it. They didn't have it this year. Do you think they'll have it in the future?
Let's hope so.
Yes, there's a 47-footer on the right, and the word about them is if they're in bad weather and it turns over, it'll come back correctly, it'll come back up and it'll still be running. And I actually asked an officer about that, and he said, well, actually, I had that experience. I was out on the West Coast. I had a cadet. I was qualifying. He hit wave broadside. We went over, and we came back up, and it was still running. And I was heard everyone was strapped in. He said, the cadet was so mortified he couldn't even talk on the way back. And but guy, a nice officer, but things do happen. And we always sometimes we talk about the fact that Merrimack is getting dirtier rather than cleaner, but many days it's just beautiful. And this is over towards Amesbury, I believe, near the Hatter's Point. And you're familiar with this area. What's across the river there, John? Can we tell?
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. There's Maudsley State Park over there. And, I was doing a little research recently on Maudsley, and it's the largest piece of land on the Merrimack River that's owned by the public, so 450 acres.
And I'd say we, the people in the North Shore, were very fortunate when that happened, because it's a wonderful asset, as you know. Here's another shot of it at the park across the way, Maudsley State Park. And not all the boats were in here in Amesbury, but there are more than 1,500 recreational boats in Newburyport each summer, about 500 in Amesbury and Salisbury. As we talk about the river, a lot has changed, of course, since 1972, when the Clean Water Act was promulgated by Senator Muskey of Maine. Here's a shot in Haverhill, which shows that Haverhill seems to be using the river as a real highlight to its rebirth as a modern community.
Yeah, that's happening in every community that's on the river. We're seeing in Lawrence and Lowell and Manchester as well, and Newburyport, of course.
So the University of Massachusetts has a branch here. Northern Essex Community College has a branch. There are numerous apartment buildings there and new stores. And so Haverhill is looking good. And Lowell is also looking good. National Park Service in Haverhill has a terrific tour that they give. You can get on a vessel, as you can see here. But they have a national historical museum there, which is a terrific thing. Now, John, I believe you've been to that, and you're a historian. I think they do some pretty good history at Lowell.
I agree. Yeah, I think Lowell does a tremendous job of showing people the history of the city. And also, look at that. I mean, that looks like a lot of fun, doesn't it? Going out on the canals and actually touring the canals. And I think when I go to Lowell, I look around at those canals and I think to myself, I can't believe these were all dug by hand.
I know.
There's 6 miles of canals there, and all done by human labor without any mechanism whatsoever, just shovels and mules and carts.
I also think, John, that, the textile industry is huge, but the brick making industry must have been very large.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that really as a joke. In Lawrence and Lowell, for instance, thousands, if not millions of bricks went in to make those places. So I do. John's been on the river a lot too. As a lot of parts of the river are still very beautiful. They look much like they looked 2 or 3 centuries ago. And here, the Merrimack near Franklin, New Hampshire, and that is above Concord. And here's a beautiful spot with white water. And it just shows you that there's a lot of natural rivers still to be had. This is in Nashua. I was curious where the Nashua River met the Merrimack. So I was walking through the parking lot of a senior citizen's home. I thought I might get picked. I finally found his place. And John, this is a pretty nice spot in Nashua. I don't know if you get that far up the river. Have you gone towards Nashua, or are you mostly down here?
I haven't been to that particular spot. It looks beautiful. I've been to a spot further up in Nashua. Nashua has some waterfront on the river too, and it has a beautiful new boat ramp, which they just put in this year. And I'd love to try to go out of that and explore the river in that area.
So John's organization, the Watershed Council, is which is based in Lawrence, really does a lot to try to bring attention to the river, attention to the needs of the river, make people aware, of it being a great asset. And even though there are many other political elements in the air, saving Merrimack and improving the Merrimack should be high on the list. This is in Manchester. We were talking about some of these areas still create hydropower, and you can see it here. And again, John, this would be a tough place for. My grandfather says I should be 10 miles north, but I can't seem to get through here.
Yeah, that's an impressive falls there. So that's a dam. That's the largest falls on the Merrimack, the Muskeg Falls. They drop about 55 feet. And my understanding is in order to get really good mill power, you need a drop of at least 30 feet. And so that's one of the reasons why the Merrimack was an industrial river. Is you have this Muskeg that's 55, and then in Lowell, which you showed earlier, the dam in Lowell, there was a falls there that fell about 30 some odd feet. And then you look at Lawrence, and Lawrence was also built on where there was an existing falls, but it was only 5 feet. And so that's why we have this enormous dam in Lawrence. It builds the level of the river up 30 feet above.
That's a good point.
Force.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. That's a good point. Here is Lowell, and as John was saying, there's all sorts of different engineering that has gone on over the years. And to the right, there's an edifice belonging to UMass Lowell. It's a dorm. It also has some stores on the bottom, but UMass Lowell has integrated well. But John, this makes one of your points is there's a lot of building and damming going on over the years.
Yeah, that's a neat shot, Dyke. One of the things I think I see in that photo on the right-hand side is what's called the Great North, I think they call it the Great Walkway, or the North Walkway, the North Canal. And when you walk on that walkway, it's over there on the right-hand side where the water is spilling down. You've been on it, I'm sure. On one side, you see the canal, and it's about a foot below you. And on the other side, you look down at the river, and it's about, 35 or 40 feet below you. And that canal is built there to funnel the Merrimack River into that huge network of canals that run through the pool.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Interesting spot.
And we're going to move along. We only have a few minutes. And I do want to thank you for being with us. You're adding some really important information. And this is Joppa Radio 96.3, also shown on Comcast Local Television, Channel 9. Here's a shot of people in Lowell enjoying the river in different ways. There's a jogger back in the background. There's a mother pushing a baby. There's some folks fishing. So a lot of people enjoy the river. And here's a shot from the old days. Love to see my point of, geez, someone ought to write a book about the brick building industry. Look at all these bricks. And here's Manchester has made a good comeback. As you said, John, to the right, you see some of the old mill buildings, which are being used very effectively in Manchester, I must say. And then you have new buildings, you have apartments and banks, and Manchester's really doing well. Here's, it's election day, so we can bring this up appropriately. We mentioned that this team, about 15 or 20, went 117 miles from Franklin to Newburyport. Now, who do you suppose is in the lead kayak here, John? It looks like our own Jim Kelcourse.
Yeah. And my understanding is he had never kayaked like this before this trip. So he really pushed himself hard.
Yeah. And they had a lot of fun.
He did.
And here is just you know, not a random picture, but this isn't white water. This is probably taking a breath. And this was upriver, and you see almost a dozen kayaks there.
Mhm.
This is good old Newburyport. John was an editor of the Newburyport, the Daily News in Newburyport for many years, and is quite familiar with it. And so over the years, it's gotten very attractive. Not so much fishing now, but it has been in the past. I just wanted to move along. John, excuse me for moving too fast, but the thing that made the modern Merrimack River what it is, it was the Clean Water Act of 1972. This is Ed Muskey from Maine, and he was certainly a major player. And he was a vice presidential candidate. He ran for president. But this, in my view, was his greatest hour. This is 1972. He was no longer a front runner for the nomination. And this was him testifying for the Clean Water Act. And that's his wife, Jane, to the left there. But Ed Muskey, John, I feel, did a great deal for the river and is one reason why it's clean today.
I would agree.
And looking for the local angle, as we always do, Paul Tsongas was helpful as well. Now, you must have been around for some of Paul Tsongas' tenure, John.
Yes, I was.
And he was a real booster of Lowell, wasn't he?
He sure was. Yeah, and it's one of the major reasons why the National Park Service is there.
And, 1978, it was built there. This is a wonderful shot of the family. That's his wife, Nikki, and the children a long, long time ago. And of course, he got ill, died at the age of 57. And she took over and was a congresswoman for close to a dozen years. Here is the resting ground of Paul Tsongas. It's along the Merrimack, as you can see. Very beautiful. And I think among the people I've known on the North Shore, he has one of the finest reputations, and people remember him fondly. He did work hard for the area. And John, this is one of the big assets been built in our area recently, the bridge from Newburyport to Amesbury. It's really helped out from what I can tell. What are your thoughts? Is this a real asset for the community?
Yeah, I agree. It's a beautiful bridge, and I remember going under the old bridge in my boat, and whenever a car would go over that bridge, you would hear a very definitive ka-thunk, ka-thunk, and you could see a metal piece moving a little bit. So I think it was a wise choice to replace that bridge.
It was about time. And here is State Senator Diana Zoglio of Methuen. She is district council and being a real advocate for the river. And I think she's done a great job. She's from Methuen, but she represents Newburyport,
Right.
every place.
I agree. She's done a
photo.
terrific job.
I'm going to try to move this away. Maybe you can see that a little better.
Yeah.
But I always think it's been a long time since I've seen a picture of Richard Nixon. Or you, Humphrey, for that matter. I had seen him at Muskey because that's what I'm writing about. I just wrote a book called Merrimack, the Resilient River, which will be out in April. But I have this here because Richard Nixon was actually a champion of clean water, because in 1970, the Clean Water Act was passed. This came shortly after the river in Cleveland caught fire. The Cuyahoga River caught fire. The nation was aghast, but they all realized, including those on the Merrimack, the rivers were dirty. So Nixon permitted Environmental Protection Agency to be created. Humphrey helped because he was a leader in the Democrats, and Ed Muskey, as we have said. But from your observation, John, and you've lived around for a while, the river has gotten a lot cleaner in recent years, has it not?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's amazing that I guess it was about 50 years ago, 1970, there was an analysis done looking at the entire river, and there was only one sewage treatment plant on the entire Merrimack, and it was the plant that's in Newburyport. No sewage plants at all. And so look how far we've come. It's now completely sewered, as 45 or 50 plants along the river. So the water is much, much cleaner than it was. And you mentioned earlier about the CSOs, so that's still a problem. And there are a lot of people working to fix that.
Mhm. Well, thank you very much. Hate to say our time is up. It's about 2:30. John, thank you very much for being our guest. John is a leader with the Watershed Council here on the North Shore. I am Dyke Hendrickson. The podcast is Life Along the Merrimack. This is 96.3 radio and Comcast TV. But thank you very much, John, for coming, and perhaps we can talk about this again sometime.
Thank you, Dyke. I appreciate the invitation. It's a
Okay.
pleasure talking with you.
Goodbye now.
Bye-bye.